She stood frozen in the glittering ballroom, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on her, like shards of broken crystal. The chandeliers swayed gently above their hundreds of candles, flickering warm gold across silk gowns and jeweled necks. Laughter rose and fell in perfect practiced waves. But inside Nora Callahan's chest, everything had gone deathly silent. "You are not his daughter." The words sliced through the music like a blade drawn slowly across skin. Vivian Caldwell's voice was calm, almost gentle, yet it carried to every corner of the room. She stood beside the grand fireplace, one gloved hand resting lightly on the mantel, her smile never wavering. Paige and Grace flanked her like two elegant shadows, and their eyes bright, with something far colder than curiosity. Nora's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass until the crystal bit into her palm. 20 years of memories flashed behind her eyes in a single heartbeat, her father's warm laugh echoing down the hallway. The way he used to call her my little star when he tucked her in at night. The quiet pride in his voice whenever he introduced her as Miss Nora Callahan, daughter of Thomas Callahan. All of it. Crumbling in this single moment. Vivian took one graceful step forward, the hem of her deep emerald gown whispering across the polished floor. "According to the will, your father left behind the entire estate, the title, every penny. It all hinges on one simple truth." Her gaze locked onto Nora's, steady and merciless. A truth he hid for far too long. "You, my dear, are not the legitimate heir. Not by blood. Not by law." A ripple of shocked whispers swept through the crowd. Fans snapped open. Gloved hands rose to cover mouths. Someone's laughter died mid-note. Nora felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Heat rushed to her face, then drained away just as fast, leaving her cold. So very cold. That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even to herself. But the room had gone so quiet that every ear caught it. Paige let out a soft, delicate laugh, the kind that sounded sweet, but cut like glass. Oh, Nora, always so trusting. Even now. Grace tilted her head, her pretty features arranged in mock sympathy. "You have 30 days. 30 days to prove you belong here, or you leave this house forever. Those were your father's exact conditions." The glass slipped from Nora's fingers and shattered against the marble with a sound like breaking ice. Red wine spread across the floor like spilled blood. No one moved to help her. Vivian's smile remained perfectly composed, beautiful and empty. "This is a house of honor, Nora. We cannot shelter secrets forever, especially not ones as dirty as yours." The word landed like a slap. Dirty. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She looked from face to face, people she had known since childhood, families her father had dined with, laughed with, trusted. Now they stared back with a mixture of pity, fascination, and cruel delight. She was no longer the cherished daughter of Thomas Callahan. She was a scandal waiting to be torn open, a secret too filthy for London's glittering salons. Her chest burned with something sharp and unfamiliar. Not just fear, not just shame. Something hotter, deeper, a flame that had been quietly smothered for years beneath layers of obedience and hope. Now beginning to flicker against the weight of ash. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers. She wanted to run to her father's study, fling open every drawer, and find the letter that would prove them all wrong. Instead, she lifted her chin, even as tears stung the corners of her eyes. "I am his daughter," she said, her voice low but steady for the first time that night. "Whatever lies you've woven, I will uncover the truth." Vivian's eyes narrowed just a fraction. The first crack in her perfect mask. Then she waved one elegant hand, as if dismissing a servant. escort her out. The air in here has grown unpleasant. Strong hands hired footmen who once bowed to her closed around Nora's arms. They guided her, not roughly but firmly, through the parting crowd. Whispers followed her like smoke. Never really looked like him, did she? Poor Thomas must have been deceived. What a tragedy for the family name. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut behind her with a final echoing thud. Nora stumbled into the grand hallway, the sudden silence ringing in her ears louder than any orchestra. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might crack. 30 days. 30 days to prove who she was, or lose everything her father had built. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, fighting the wave of nausea. Memories flooded in, unbidden her father's gentle smile, the way his eyes crinkled when he was proud of her. Had it all been a lie, or had he been protecting her from something far darker? The front doors loomed ahead. Beyond them, rain hammered the London streets in silver sheets. Nora didn't wait for the footman to open them. She pushed through into the storm. Cold rain struck her face like needles soaking her silk gown in seconds. Her hair tumbled from its pins, dark strands clinging to her cheeks. She didn't care. She ran. Down the wide stone steps, past the glowing windows, where shadows still moved, and laughed away from the house that had been her entire world. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Anger and despair twisted together inside her chest until she could hardly tell them apart. How dare they? How dare Vivian stand there and rewrite her entire life with a few calm, poisonous words? How dare the world believe it so easily? Yet beneath the fury, a quieter, more terrifying question whispered in the back of her mind. What if they were right? What if everything she had believed about herself was built on sand? Nora stopped at the edge of the driveway, chest heaving, rain streaming down her face like tears she refused to shed. She looked back once at the grand house, its windows blazing with light and warmth she was no longer welcome to share. Then she turned toward the dark, wet streets of London. Somewhere out there was the truth. Somewhere out there was a flame that refused to stay buried. And she would find it, even if it burned her alive. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Nora stood on the cracked stone steps of her father's old country house, the one he had rarely visited in his final years. The ivy clung too tightly to the walls, as if trying to hide the neglect. Her cloak was still damp from the long journey, heavy against her shoulders. She pushed the door open. Inside, dust floated in the thin shafts of gray light that slipped through the shuttered windows. The air smelled of old wood and forgotten memories. For a moment, she simply stood there, heart hammering, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the past might shatter around her. Then she heard footsteps. Light. Familiar. Nora Daisy Holt appeared at the end of the hallway, lantern in hand. Her simple wool dress and kind eyes were the first warm thing Nora had seen since that terrible night in London. Without a word, Daisy crossed the distance and pulled her into a tight embrace. "You came," Daisy whispered against her hair. "I was so afraid you wouldn't." They sat together in the small parlor, where the fire struggled to chase away the chill. Daisy poured tea with steady hands, while Nora's trembled around the cup. "I have something you need to see," Daisy said quietly. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a small tin box, its edges worn smooth by time. Inside were letters, yellowed, tied with faded ribbon. Nora's breath caught as she opened the first one. The handwriting was her father's, strong, slanted, unmistakable. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And the burden I carried has finally passed to the one person who deserves the truth." Nora read slowly, each word landing like a stone in still water. Her father had been married once before, a quiet, secret union when he was very young. The woman had died in childbirth, taking their infant son with her. He had never spoken of it, not once. But the letter went further. There is more, my girl. Something I should have told you long ago. Something Vivian has known and used against us both. Daisy watched her in silence, eyes full of gentle sorrow. Your father trusted my mother with these, Daisy said softly. Mrs. Eleanor Holt kept them safe all these years. She said the truth can hurt, but lies are what truly kill the soul. Nora closed her eyes. The flame inside her chest flickered harder now. Not yet ablaze, but no longer smothered. She could not return to London empty-handed, not with only 27 days left. So she made a choice. The next morning, she walked 2 miles to the neighboring estate and offered her services as a private secretary to Lady Worthington, a minor noblewoman who needed someone discreet to handle correspondence. The pay was small. The work was beneath her station, but it gave her a reason to stay in the countryside and a reason to keep digging. Every evening after finishing her duties, Nora returned to the old house and searched. Drawers, cabinets, the dusty attic where trunks lay forgotten. She worked until her eyes burned and her fingers ached. One night, exhaustion pulled her into a fragile sleep in her father's old study. She dreamed of his voice calling her name warm and proud, only to wake to the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive outside. Curious, she stepped to the window. A tall man dismounted from a black horse under the moonlight. His coat was dark, his movements precise and controlled. Even from a distance, she could feel the weight he carried, the kind that came from old wounds that never quite healed. Cole Harrington, Duke of Ralston. She had heard the name before. The reclusive Duke who rarely attended society events. The man whose silence spoke louder than most men's words. He was not supposed to be here. The next afternoon, fate pushed them closer. Nora had been sent by Lady Worthington to deliver papers to a small gathering at a nearby hunting lodge. The room was thick with cigar smoke and loud male laughter. One gentleman, Lord Sedgwick, already deep in his cups, spotted her as she tried to slip out unnoticed. Well, if it isn't the little fallen heiress everyone's whispering about. His voice boomed. Heads turned. Nora froze, cheeks burning. You think you can hide out here playing secretary? He sneered, stepping closer, wine sloshing from his glass. Your father must be spinning in his grave, or perhaps he's laughing at the bastard he tried to pass off as his own. The words hit like a physical blow. Nora's throat tightened. She wanted to run, but her feet would not move. Shame and anger warred inside her, threatening to choke her. Then a quiet voice cut through the room. Enough. Cole Harrington stepped forward from the shadows near the fireplace. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The single word carried the weight of his title and something far more dangerous, absolute certainty. Lord Sedgwick blinked, suddenly sober enough to recognize the danger. Your Grace, you were embarrassing yourself, Cole said calmly. His dark eyes flicked to Nora for the briefest moment. And insulting a lady. Leave. Now. The room fell silent. Sedgwick muttered something under his breath, but backed away, the other men parting to let him stumble out. Cole turned to Nora. He did not offer pity. He did not ask questions. He simply inclined his head once with quiet respect. Miss Callahan. Then he walked out, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. Nora stood there long after the door closed, heart racing for an entirely different reason now. Not fear, not shame. Something quieter, warmer, a fragile thread of respect from a man who owed her nothing. That night back at her father's old house, she could not sleep. She returned to the tin box and kept searching until her fingers found a folded document tucked deep inside an old ledger. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a letter from Vivian Caldwell dated 2 years before her father's death. Cold, calculated instructions to a solicitor. Instructions to alter dates, to obscure records, to ensure that if Thomas Callahan ever tried to change his will, certain truths would remain conveniently buried. Nora stared at the signature, elegant, unmistakable. Vivian had been planning this for years. The iron door inside Nora's heart, the one that still wanted to believe in family and fairness in the world as she once knew. It slammed shut with a final painful clang. She was no longer waiting for permission to fight. She was done being the girl who stood trembling in ballrooms while others decided her worth. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the dark fields. Nora folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her cloak. The flame was no longer buried. It was beginning to burn. The journey back to London felt longer than it should have. Nora kept the small bundle of letters hidden inside her cloak, pressed tight against her heart, like a fragile secret that could either save her or destroy her completely. Every jolt of the carriage made her stomach tighten. Every shadow on the roadside felt like eyes watching. She told herself she was ready. She wasn't. Benjamin Hart's office sat tucked away in a narrow, fog-dampened street in the legal quarter. The wooden stairs creaked under her boots as she climbed. When she finally stepped inside, the room smelled of old paper ink and quiet desperation. Benjamin looked up from his desk. He was older than she remembered, his hair more silver, but his eyes still held the same steady kindness her father had once trusted. "Miss Callahan," he said softly, rising to his feet. "I've been expecting you." He did not waste time with pleasantries. They sat across from each other beneath the weak glow of a single oil lamp. Nora placed the letters on the desk with trembling hands. Benjamin read in silence. When he reached the final page, he exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding that breath for years. "Your father had a first marriage," he said at last, his voice low and careful. "It was brief and tragic. The child from that union did not survive. But the records were never properly closed. Legally, you are the only direct blood heir, the sole legitimate successor to the Callahan estate and title." Nora's breath caught. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they landed like stones in deep water, sending ripples of fear through her. Benjamin leaned forward, his expression grave. Vivian Caldwell knew. She paid certain witnesses to forget what they saw and to remember only what served her. She has been preparing for this moment longer than you can imagine. The room seemed to grow smaller. Nora's fingers dug into the arms of the chair until her knuckles turned white. She had come seeking truth. Now the truth was staring back at her, sharp enough to cut. That night she barely slept. The next morning, an invitation arrived by messenger and offered to serve as private note-taker for a private gathering hosted by Lord Marcus Fenwick and his wife Lydia. It was the kind of quiet, influential evening where deals were made and futures decided. Nora accepted. She told herself it was only for information, but deep down, she knew she was stepping onto a battlefield wearing nothing but silk and courage. The Fenwick drawing room glowed with candlelight and whispered ambition. Nora sat in a corner pen, moving steadily across the paper recording conversations that meant nothing to her. Until Vivian's voice drifted through the half-open door of the adjoining study. Paige will make an excellent match for the Duke of Ralston. Once they are wed, the Callahan properties will naturally fall under our influence. The girl has no real claim. We simply need to remove the last obstacles. Nora's pen stilled. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she feared the sound would betray her. Paige, marrying Cole Harrington. The thought sent an unexpected twist of something sharp and painful through her chest. Not jealousy exactly. Something more like grief for a future that was never hers to begin with. She forced her hand to keep writing, but the words blurred on the page. Later, as the guests began to leave, a tall figure appeared beside her table. Cole Harrington. He had come looking for her. He did not smile. He simply stood there studying her face with those dark, unreadable eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted to show. "Miss Callahan," he said quietly. A word they stepped onto the dimly lit terrace. Cool night air brushed against her heated skin. Cole was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "I lost someone once," he said, his voice rough at the edges. "Someone I loved more than reason. A scandal tore her away from me, and I have carried the blame ever since. It taught me that love is a dangerous thing to trust. It leaves too many wounds." He looked at her, then really looked. "But watching you stand your ground these past weeks, it reminds me that some people still fight for what is right, even when the world tells them they have no right to exist." Nora's throat tightened. She wanted to say something clever, something strong. Instead, her voice came out small and honest. "I'm terrified, Your Grace, every single day." Cole gave the faintest nod, as if her fear did not diminish her in his eyes. "Fear does not make you weak, Miss Callahan. Pretending you feel none, that is what breaks most people." Before she could answer, Daisy appeared at the edge of the terrace, her presence like a steady anchor in rough seas. She waited until Cole had taken his leave with a quiet bow, then stepped closer and took Nora's cold hands in hers. "You are not alone in this fight," Daisy whispered fiercely. "Not anymore. My mother and I stand with you. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Nora felt the flame inside her chest flare brighter. The fear was still there, heavy and real, but it no longer filled every corner of her heart. Something else was growing beside it now. Resolve, determination, the courage to stop hiding from the truth and start chasing it. 2 days later, a single letter arrived at her modest lodgings. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant but restrained. It was signed simply Clayton Ashby. He wished to meet her, privately. He claimed to hold information about her father's first marriage that no one else possessed. Nora stared at the letter for a long time, her pulse quickening. A distant relative she had never met. A man stepping out of the shadows at the exact moment everything was beginning to burn. She folded the letter slowly, pressing it against her palm. The flame beneath the ashes was no longer flickering. It had begun to roar. The fog clung to the Thames like a heavy veil that morning. Nora pulled her cloak tighter as she stepped into the small, weathered coffee house tucked along the riverbank. The air inside smelled of roasted beans, damp wood, and old secrets. A lone figure sat at a corner table near the window, Clayton Ashby. He rose when she approached, tall silver at the temples, with eyes that carried the weight of too many silent years. "Miss Callahan," he said quietly, his voice steady, but laced with something almost like regret. "Thank you for coming." They sat. For a long moment, neither spoke. Nora's hands rested on the table, fingers laced tightly to hide their trembling. Clayton reached into his coat and placed a small packet of documents before her. Yellowed edges, faded seals, a marriage certificate, a letter written in her father's hand, and a single gold locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman Nora had never seen. "Your father's first wife," Clayton said softly. "I stood as witness at their wedding. I held her hand when she passed. And I watched your father carry the grief alone. Until he met your mother." Nora stared at the papers. Her throat tightened until breathing hurt. Clayton continued his gaze, never leaving her face. "Vivian Caldwell found out about the first marriage years ago. She threatened my family, my wife, my daughter if I ever spoke of it. I stayed silent to protect them, but silence has a cost. I can no longer pay it." Tears burned behind Nora's eyes, not from sadness alone, but from the sudden, overwhelming relief of finally being believed. She was not a mistake. She was not a lie. She was the rightful heir. That same afternoon, she met Benjamin Hart again. Together in the dim light of his office, they worked side by side drafting the formal petition. Every word felt like another brick laid in the foundation of her future. Yet with every line they wrote, the fear grew heavier, the knowledge that once this document was filed, there would be no turning back. They were still sealing the final copy when the scandal broke. Whispers raced through London drawing rooms like wildfire. Vivian Caldwell had made sure of it. "The Callahan girl is nothing but a bastard child," people murmured. "She has bewitched the Duke of Ralston with her lies. Poor man trapped by a clever fortune hunter." The words reached Nora while she was walking back from Benjamin's office. Each one landed like a stone against her ribs. That evening, she stood before the mirror in her modest room, fingers trembling as she fastened the last button on her gown. The Fenwick ball was the last place she wanted to be, but Daisy had insisted she attend to show the world she would not hide. The ballroom was a sea of color and light. Nora moved through it like a ghost, chin high, even as her heart pounded. Then she saw them. Paige Caldwell, radiant in crimson silk, standing before Cole Harrington with a smile full of calculated sweetness. "Your Grace," Paige said, her voice carrying just far enough, "I have long admired your strength. My mother and I believe we could build something lasting together. A union that would benefit both our families." The room seemed to hold its breath. Cole looked at Paige for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned his gaze across the ballroom, straight to Nora. He crossed the floor in measured steps. The crowd parted instinctively. When he reached her, he did not speak flowery declarations. He simply offered his arm. Nora hesitated only a heartbeat before slipping her hand through it. Together, they walked past Paige, past Vivian's frozen stare, past every whispering mouth in the room. Cole's silence was louder than any speech. His quiet choice to stand beside her said everything. Later, on a quiet balcony away from the music, Nora finally found her voice. "Why," she whispered, "why risk your name for me?" Cole looked out over the darkened garden, his jaw tight with memories he rarely shared. "Because I know what it feels like when the world tries to rewrite your story," he said. "And because watching you fight has reminded me that some hearts are still worth protecting." Something inside Nora shifted, then a door she had kept tightly locked began to open. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the warmth of hope, to acknowledge the quiet pull she had felt toward him since that night at the hunting lodge. Not gratitude alone, something deeper, something that felt dangerously like love. Daisy found her later that night waiting with Mrs. Eleanor Holt in a small antechamber. Daisy took both her hands, eyes shining with fierce loyalty. "You are not fighting alone," she said. "We stand with you, always." Mrs. Eleanor Holt nodded, her voice gentle but strong. "True friendship and loyalty are the only things scandal cannot steal. Hold on to them, child." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Nora and Benjamin Hart delivered the petition to the magistrate's office. The clerk stamped it with a heavy thud. The hearing was set. In exactly 2 weeks, the truth would finally step into the light. Nora stood on the steps outside the morning mist, cool against her flushed cheeks. Her heart raced with a mixture of terror and fierce burning hope. The turning point had arrived, and whatever came next, victory or ruin, she would face it with her head held high and her flame no longer hidden. The courtroom smelled of polished oak and nervous silence. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted like tiny, uncertain stars. Nora sat between Benjamin Hart and Evan Reed, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Vivian Caldwell sat perfectly composed in deep charcoal silk, Paige and Grace beside her, like two pale reflections. Judge Alan Ford called the session to order with a quiet rap of his gavel. Benjamin Hart rose first. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of decades of quiet integrity. He laid out the documents one by one, the original marriage certificate, the letter from Clayton Ashby, the proof of Vivian's threats and bribes. Each piece landed with a soft thud of undeniable truth. Evan Reed followed, his younger voice sharper, pointing out the forged dates and altered records with precise, relentless clarity. Nora watched Vivian's face. For the first time in all these weeks, the older woman's perfect mask began to crack. A slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. A flicker of something raw and ugly in her eyes when the judge asked her directly about the payments made to silenced witnesses. Vivian's gloved hands clenched once, then stilled. When it was Nora's turn to speak, the room grew so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She stood slowly. Her legs felt unsteady, but she gripped the edge of the table and lifted her chin. "I did not come here for revenge," she said, her voice low at first, then growing steadier with every word. "I came for the truth. My father was not perfect. He carried secrets and regrets. But he loved me, and I refused to let anyone rewrite that love into something shameful." She looked straight at Vivian. "Dignity is not something granted by bloodlines or titles. It is something we choose every single day by how we treat others and how we refuse to be broken when the world tries to break us." Her voice caught for just a moment. Memories of cold rain on her face, of shattered wine glasses, and whispering crowds flashed behind her eyes. She pushed them down gently. "I choose truth today, not because it is easy, but because it is mine." She sat down. The silence that followed, I felt endless. Judge Alan Ford leaned forward, his expression solemn but kind. After reviewing all evidence, he said, "This court declares Miss Nora Callahan the sole legitimate heir to the Callahan estate and title. All prior manipulations are hereby nullified." A sharp inhale came from Vivian's side of the room. "The matter of fraud and coercion will be referred to further proceedings." Vivian rose slowly, her face pale, but still proud. Paige and Grace looked smaller somehow, their usual confidence stripped away by the weight of consequences they could no longer escape. For the first time, Nora felt no satisfaction in their discomfort, only a quiet sadness for lives built on lies. It was over. Not with fireworks or dramatic shouts, but with the steady, quiet click of justice finally locking into place. 2 weeks later, the gardens at Ralston Park bloomed with early spring color. Nora walked the gravel paths alone at first, breathing in the soft scent of new leaves and damp earth. She had returned to her father's old country house the week before, spending long days directing repairs, fixing broken shutters, clearing overgrown vines, planting fresh rose bushes where thorns had once taken over. Each hammer strike each handful of soil felt like healing, like choosing to build again instead of staying buried. Now she stood beneath the ancient oak at the center of Cole's private garden, sunlight warming her face. Footsteps approached behind her, slow, deliberate. Cole Harrington stopped a few paces away. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes carrying everything he had never been good at saying aloud. Then he stepped closer. "Nora," he said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I have spent years believing love was too dangerous to risk again. But watching you fight for your truth, watching you stand when everything tried to knock you down, it woke something in me I thought was long dead." He reached into his coat and took out a simple but elegant ring, a single sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. "I am not asking because society expects it. I am not asking because of estates or titles. I am asking because I have fallen in love with the woman who refused to let the world define her worth." He lowered himself to one knee, his gaze never leaving hers. "Will you marry me?" Nora's breath trembled. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming sweetness of being truly seen. She thought of the cold rain that night outside the ballroom, of the iron door inside her heart that had finally swung open, of the quiet strength Cole had shown her when she needed it most. "Yes," she whispered, then again stronger. "Yes, Cole, I will." He rose and slipped the ring onto her finger. For a moment they simply stood there, foreheads touching, breathing the same spring air. Later that afternoon, under the same golden light, Nora walked the garden once more, this time with Cole beside her. Daisy Holt waited near the rose beds, her smile bright and teary. Mrs. Eleanor Holt stood a little behind her hands, folded eyes warm with quiet pride. Benjamin Hart had come too, nodding with the satisfied look of a man who had finally set something right. They did not cheer or make grand speeches. They simply stood together, a small circle of people who had chosen truth over comfort, loyalty over fear. Nora looked out across the garden toward the distant fields, Cole's hand warm and steady in hers. The future stretched before them, not perfect, not without scars, but honest. And for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid of what it might hold. Because she had learned the hardest, most beautiful truth of all. Real honor does not live in bloodlines or grand titles. It lives in the quiet courage to stand up when the world tries to bury you, and in the love that grows stronger when two wounded hearts choose to heal together. This story leaves us with a simple but powerful reminder. Justice may arrive late, but when it finally comes, it brings light strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds, if we are brave enough to step into it. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso Legal/Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.